Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where even murder can be considered a soft lullaby. You poured the wine yourself, stirred it twice, watched him smile, and whispered goodnight as his lungs forgot how to contract. Thank you for letting these stories lull you into stranger dreams. If they've helped you drift or simply distracted you from the ceiling, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what hour it is for you there. Tonight you light the chapel, kiss the seal, and lull a kingdom into trusting your silence, just before you kill its conscience in a robe. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your body sink a little deeper into the mattress. Let the sheets wrap around your arms like a pact not to move. Let your breath slow, slower still until it barely matters. You are not here. You are somewhere colder, older, a place you've dreamed before but never dared to name. Stone corridors breathe incense and oil. Velvet drapes do not stir. A priest's sandal kisses the floor. And behind the altar, behind the candlelight, a blade is waiting, warmed by a hand that trembles but doesn't hesitate. Sleep well. Sleep well, fellow listeners. The year was 1120, give or take a few calendar disputes, and London was exactly as glamorous as you'd expect from a city where the Thames doubled as both a highway and a latrine. Into this metropolitan paradise of mud, merchants, and the occasional plague scare, Thomas Becket was born, to parents who had mastered the art of being just wealthy enough to have ambitions, but not quite wealthy enough to fulfill them without excessive grovelling. His father, Gilbert Becket, was a Norman merchant who'd arrived in England with the same entrepreneurial spirit that drove men to sell dubious relics to pilgrims. His mother, Matilda, came from Caen, bringing with her the kind of refined Norman sensibilities that made her look down on the local Anglo-Saxons, while simultaneously selling them overpriced imported cloth. Together they produced Thomas, a boy who would inherit his father's business acumen and his mother's talent for making people feel inferior without saying a word. Young Thomas grew up on Cheapside, which, despite its name, was actually one of London's more expensive neighbourhoods, proving that medieval estate agents were just as dishonest as their modern counterparts. The Becket household was a curious blend of merchant practicality and social aspiration. While other children played with wooden swords and dreamed of knighthood, Thomas played with abacuses and dreamed of owning multiple properties with complicated lease agreements. But Thomas wasn't content with mere merchant success. No, he had noticed something important about medieval society. The real power wasn't in selling cloth or spices. It was in wearing fancy hats and telling other people what God wanted. The church, you see, was essentially a multinational corporation with better architecture and more creative accounting practices. Bishops owned land, collected taxes, and occasionally remembered to mention Jesus between property disputes. It was perfect for an ambitious boy with a head for numbers and a talent for looking pious while calculating compound interest. His education began at home, where he learned the basics: how to count money in 3 different currencies, how to smile at customers while mentally calculating their net worth, and, most importantly, how to pronounce Latin words with enough confidence that no one would dare correct him. But this wasn't enough. Thomas needed proper schooling, the kind that came with connections and the subtle art of name-dropping. At the age of 10, he was packed off to Merton Priory in Surrey, which was less a religious institution and more a finishing school for boys whose parents couldn't afford nobility but refused to accept mediocrity. The monks at Merton had perfected the art of education through intimidation, teaching Latin grammar with the same intensity that military academies would later teach close-order drill. Thomas thrived in this environment, possibly because he was the only student who genuinely enjoyed memorizing declensions. The curriculum at Merton was diverse, covering everything from theology, how to argue about things that couldn't be proven, to rhetoric, how to argue about things that could be proven but shouldn't be, to mathematics, how to argue about who owed whom money. Thomas excelled at all of these, but his real talent lay in what wasn't taught: the ability to make friends with people who might be useful later. After Merton, Thomas moved on to the schools of London, which were essentially medieval debate clubs, where teenagers argued about whether angels could dance on the head of a pin, while completely missing the point that angels probably had better things to do. Here, Thomas learned the finer points of dialectic, which is a fancy word for winning arguments through sheer endurance. He also learned law, which in medieval times meant memorizing contradictory precedents and choosing whichever one suited your client's needs. But Thomas's real education came from watching the city around him. London in the 1130s was a fascinating mixture of ambition and squalor, where merchants rubbed shoulders with nobles and everyone tried to avoid stepping in something unpleasant. The city had recovered from the various Norman tantrums that followed the conquest and was busy becoming the commercial heart of England. Thomas watched the merchants in their guild halls, the lawyers in their courts, and the clergy in their chapters, and he took notes. He noticed that successful men had three things in common. They dressed better than their income suggested, they knew everyone's business but revealed nothing of their own, and they always had a godfather. Not the Italian kind, that would come later, but the medieval kind, a powerful patron who could open doors, arrange introductions, and occasionally bail you out when your ambitions exceeded your abilities. Thomas began collecting godfathers like other young men collected gambling debts. There was Richer de Laigue, a Norman noble who taught him that the secret to power was making other people think you already had it. There was the mysterious, wealthy citizen of London, mentioned in the Chronicles, who probably taught him that anonymity and generosity were a powerful combination. Each connection was carefully cultivated, each relationship maintained with the dedication of a gardener tending prize roses. By his late teens, Thomas had transformed himself from a merchant's son into something altogether more dangerous. A young man who understood systems. He knew how the church worked, badly but profitably, how the law worked, inconsistently but exploitably, and how society worked, unfairly but predictably. He dressed like someone who had already succeeded, spoke like someone who had read more books than he actually had, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, even if he hadn't quite figured out how to get there yet. It was around this time that fate, in the form of his father's business connections, intervened. Gilbert Becket's merchant network included some impressively placed people, including Theobald of Bec, who would soon become Archbishop of Canterbury. When young Thomas needed a position that would advance his career beyond the merchant halls of London, his father knew exactly which strings to pull. The introduction to Theobald came at the perfect moment. The future archbishop was assembling his household, looking for young men who combined intelligence with ambition and education with flexibility. Thomas was everything Theobald could want, educated enough to handle complex theological arguments, worldly enough to understand political realities, and ambitious enough to make himself useful in whatever capacity was required. When Theobald was elevated to the Archbishopric of Canterbury in 1138, Thomas was perfectly positioned to follow him. By 1143, he had secured a place in the Archbishop's household, not through noble birth or family connections, but through the medieval equivalent of networking and a really impressive resume. He was about 25, older than most who entered such service, but with a sophistication that made him invaluable. The Archbishop's household was like a medieval think tank, if think tanks were staffed by men who could recite the Psalms while simultaneously calculating the tax revenue of Kent. Thomas found himself surrounded by the brightest minds in England, all of them jockeying for position while pretending to be devoted solely to God's work. It was exactly where he belonged. The work was varied and challenging. One day Thomas might be drafting a letter to Rome, explaining why the Archbishop's latest decision was definitely in accordance with canon law, despite appearances to the contrary. The next, he might be negotiating with a baron who thought ecclesiastical taxes were more like ecclesiastical suggestions. He learnt to navigate the complex relationships between church and crown, between different factions within the church, and between the ideal of Christian poverty and the reality of maintaining huge estates. Under Theobald's tutelage, Thomas learned the real business of the church. This had very little to do with saving souls, and quite a lot to do with property law, diplomatic correspondence, and the delicate art of threatening excommunication without actually following through. He learned that canon law was wonderfully flexible if you knew which precedents to cite, that papal bulls could be interpreted in at least 3 different ways depending on your needs, and that the phrase, "for the glory of God," could justify almost anything if you said it with enough conviction. The England Thomas served in was a complicated place. King Stephen sat uneasily on the throne, his claim disputed by the Empress Matilda in what historians would later call the Anarchy. It was essentially a decades-long argument about succession, conducted with armies instead of lawyers. though lawyers were certainly involved in the aftermath. The church's role in this mess was to provide moral authority to whichever side was currently winning, while maintaining enough flexibility to switch sides when necessary. Thomas proved exceptionally good at this balancing act. He could draft letters that supported Stephen while leaving room to support Matilda if circumstances changed. He could negotiate agreements that sounded binding but contained enough ambiguity to be renegotiated later. He had the gift of making everyone feel like he was on their side, while actually being on his own side, which in medieval politics was a survival skill. As the 1140s progressed, Thomas's responsibilities increased. He wasn't just a clerk anymore, he was Theobald's problem solver, the man who could untangle complex disputes, smooth over difficult relationships, and make inconvenient problems disappear into a fog of legal precedents and theological arguments. He travelled to Rome on the archbishop's business, navigating the papal curia with the skill of someone who understood that the Vatican was essentially a very holy bureaucracy with excellent art. These trips to Rome were educational in more ways than one. Thomas saw how the universal church operated at its highest levels, where spiritual authority mixed with temporal politics in ways that would have scandalized ordinary believers. He learned that popes were politicians as much as spiritual leaders, that cardinals could be bought with the right combination of flattery and favors, and that the machinery of the church ran on ambition as much as faith. Back in England, Thomas used this knowledge to increase his own influence. He built networks of contacts that extended from Roman cardinals to English parish priests. He knew which bishops owed their positions to Theobald's influence, which ones were plotting against him, and which ones could be turned with the right incentives. He became indispensable to Theobald, the spider at the centre of an ecclesiastical web. But Thomas was already looking beyond his current position. He'd risen as far as he could in the archbishop's household without becoming a bishop himself, and bishoprics required the kind of political manoeuvring that made his current work look simple. Besides, Thomas had noticed something interesting. The real power in England wasn't in the church, it was in the crown. And the crown was about to change hands in a way that would create opportunities for ambitious men who knew how to seize them. In 1153, after years of civil war that had exhausted everyone except the arms dealers, Stephen and Matilda's son Henry reached an agreement. Stephen would remain king until his death, but Henry would succeed him. It was the kind of compromise that came from mutual exhaustion rather than mutual respect, but it promised something England desperately needed: stability. Thomas, with his gift for anticipating political changes, began preparing for the new regime. He made sure to be visible during negotiations between Stephen and Henry. He demonstrated his usefulness to both sides while committing to neither. He was like a medieval free agent, advertising his skills to the highest bidder while maintaining his current employment. When Stephen died in October 1154 and Henry II took the throne, Thomas was perfectly positioned for advancement. The new king was young, energetic, and ambitious. He wanted to restore royal authority, reform the government, and generally make England work properly after decades of dysfunction. To do this, he would need able administrators, men who understood both how things currently worked and how they could work better. Theobald, with his gift for political survival, immediately allied himself with the new regime. He also saw an opportunity to place his protégé in a position where he could influence royal policy in ways favourable to the church. When Henry mentioned needing a chancellor, someone who could handle the complex business of government while the king handled the complex business of being king, Theobald knew exactly whom to recommend. The recommendation was made with the kind of glowing praise that suggested Thomas could walk on water if the Thames wasn't so polluted. He was brilliant with law, Theobald assured the king. He understood finance better than most treasurers. He had connections throughout Europe. Most importantly, he had the kind of flexible loyalty that meant he'd serve his master faithfully as long as his master deserved it. Henry, who collected talented subordinates the way other monarchs collected taxes, was intrigued. He arranged to meet this paragon of administrative virtue, and Thomas prepared for the interview of his lifetime. He dressed carefully, well enough to show respect, not so well as to appear presumptuous. He prepared answers to every possible question, anticipated every possible objection, and generally approached the meeting like a general preparing for battle. The meeting between Henry and Thomas in late 1154 was one of those historical moments that seemed ordinary at the time, but would reshape England. Two ambitious men, both convinced of their own brilliance, both looking for allies in their respective missions. Henry saw in Thomas a tool for implementing his vision of royal supremacy. Thomas saw in Henry a ladder to heights no merchant's son could otherwise reach. They talked for hours, discussing law, finance, administration, and the delicate problem of extracting money from nobles who believed taxes were for other people. Thomas displayed his knowledge without showing off, made suggestions without seeming presumptuous, and generally performed the delicate dance of impressing a king without threatening him. By the end of the meeting, Henry had made his decision. Thomas Becket would be his Chancellor, the second most powerful man in England after the king himself. It was a meteoric rise for a merchant's son from Cheapside, the kind of success story that would inspire other ambitious young men, if it didn't end in disaster. But that was still in the future. For now, Thomas had achieved what he'd been working toward his entire life. Real power, not just the reflected glory of serving powerful men. As 1154 drew to a close, Thomas prepared for his new role with a thoroughness that had characterized his entire career. He studied the workings of the exchequer, familiarized himself with royal finances, and began planning the reforms that would make Henry's government the most efficient in Europe. He was about to transform from the Archbishop's clever assistant to the King's right hand, from a behind-the-scenes operator to one of the most visible men in England. The merchant's son had climbed almost to the top of the ladder. Only one question remained. What would he do when he got there? But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, picture Thomas on the eve of his transformation, poised between the ecclesiastical world that had nurtured him and the secular world that promised him everything. He'd spent 35 years preparing for this moment, and he was ready. Or at least, he thought he was. Because medieval politics had a way of surprising even the most prepared, and Thomas Becket was about to discover that serving a king was considerably more complicated than serving an archbishop. But those complications would come soon enough. Tonight, let him savour his success, plan his future, and dream of the power that would soon be his. The stage was set, the actors in place, and the first act of one of history's great political dramas was about to begin. Thomas Becket, merchant's son, Archbishop's clerk, and soon-to-be Royal Chancellor, stood on the threshold of greatness. What he would do with that greatness, and what it would do to him, remained to be seen. The winter of 1155 arrived with the kind of bone-chilling determination that made England's new Chancellor grateful for his upgraded wardrobe. Thomas Becket had traded the respectable but modest robes of an archiepiscopal clerk for the magnificent garments befitting the king's chief minister, and he wore them with the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting his entire life for an excuse to dress this well. The transformation from Theobald's assistant to Henry's Chancellor was more than just a change of employer. It was a complete metamorphosis. Where Archbishop's clerk Thomas had been careful, measured, and diplomatically invisible, Chancellor Thomas exploded onto the political scene like a peacock that had discovered steroids. His household expanded overnight from a modest arrangement, suitable for a senior clerk, to a small army of servants, secretaries, guards, and specialists in tasks so specific they probably had to invent their own job titles. Henry II watched this transformation with the satisfaction of a theatre director whose leading actor had exceeded expectations. The king had gambled on Thomas, promoting a relatively obscure administrator to one of the highest offices in the land, and Thomas was repaying that gamble with interest. Here was a chancellor who understood that government was partly administration and partly performance art, and Thomas was exceptional at both. Their working relationship began with the kind of intensity usually reserved for new love affairs or particularly engaging siege warfare. Henry was everywhere at once, inspecting castles, reviewing laws, hunting both animals and tax evaders, and generally behaving like a man who'd been given a kingdom-sized to-do list and was determined to complete it yesterday. Thomas was right beside him, translating royal energy into practical policy, turning the king's grand visions into workable plans, and occasionally reminding Henry that even kings needed to sleep sometimes. The Exchequer was Thomas's first major reform project. This ancient institution, where royal revenues were counted out on a checkered cloth like the world's most expensive board game, had grown creaky with age and creative accounting. Sheriffs would arrive to present their revenues, placing coins on the appropriate squares, while clerks recorded the amounts with the kind of elaborate notation that suggested they were being paid by the pen stroke. Thomas streamlined the entire process with the efficiency of a man who found financial disorder personally offensive. He introduced new accounting methods that made embezzlement harder and detection easier. He standardized procedures across all counties, because having different rules in different places was inefficient and made fraud unnecessarily complicated. He even reformed the actual counting process, introducing novel concepts like arithmetic and expecting numbers to add up correctly. The sheriffs, who had grown comfortable with the old system's flexibility, found themselves facing a chancellor who knew exactly how much revenue each shire should produce and had distressing ideas about what should happen to sheriffs who fell short. Thomas's interrogations at the Exchequer became legendary for their thoroughness. He could spot a discrepancy in accounts like a hawk spotting a mouse, and his pursuit of missing funds was equally predatory. But it wasn't just about the money, though the money was certainly nice. Thomas understood that efficient administration was the foundation of royal power. A king who knew exactly what resources he had could plan accordingly. A king whose officials knew they were being watched would serve more honestly. A king whose government actually worked would be respected rather than merely feared. The legal reforms were equally ambitious. Henry had inherited a justice system that was less a system and more a collection of competing jurisdictions held together by tradition and occasional violence. Royal courts, baronial courts, ecclesiastical courts, and manor courts all claimed authority, often over the same cases. The result was a legal maze where justice depended less on law and more on which court you could afford to shop your case to. Thomas and Henry attacked this problem with their characteristic combination of intelligence and determination. They expanded royal justice, creating a system where the king's courts could hear appeals from baronial courts. They standardized procedures because having different laws in different places was confusing and made it too easy for the wealthy to manipulate the system. They even began codifying laws, writing down what had previously been oral tradition, subject to creative interpretation. The barons, predictably, were furious. They saw their traditional rights being eroded by a merchant's son who had the audacity to suggest that justice should be consistent rather than personally profitable. But Thomas had anticipated their resistance. He implemented changes gradually, always framing them as returns to ancient custom rather than innovations. He was particularly gifted at finding obscure precedents that supported whatever Henry wanted to do, proving that legal research was just history with an agenda. The Church watched these reforms with mixed feelings. On one hand, Thomas was one of their own, trained in their schools and ordained in their orders. On the other hand, he was helping Henry strengthen royal power in ways that would inevitably conflict with ecclesiastical privilege. For now, the conflict was potential rather than actual, but astute observers could see storm clouds gathering. Thomas navigated these tensions with remarkable skill. When negotiating with bishops, he could speak their language, quote their authorities, and generally make them feel like he was still on their side while picking their pockets for the royal treasury. When dealing with barons, he combined aristocratic manners with bureaucratic efficiency, making them feel respected while documenting their every obligation to the crown. But it was in his personal relationship with Henry that Thomas truly excelled. The king and his chancellor developed a friendship that went beyond professional collaboration. They hunted together, with Thomas proving surprisingly adept at the aristocratic sport, despite his bourgeois origins. They dined together, with Thomas's table becoming legendary for its combination of excellent food and even better conversation. They even played together, engaging in the kind of masculine bonding that involved competing over everything from chess to theology. Their friendship had an element of genuine affection rare in medieval politics. Henry, isolated by his position and temperament, found in Thomas someone who could match his intelligence and energy. Thomas, always the outsider despite his success, found in Henry a patron who valued ability over ancestry. They were in many ways kindred spirits. Brilliant, ambitious men who believed that competence mattered more than convention. This personal connection made their professional partnership even more effective. When Henry raged, and Henry's rages were legendary, featuring creative profanity in multiple languages and occasionally thrown furniture, Thomas knew how to calm him. When Thomas became too caught up in administrative details, Henry knew how to refocus him on larger goals. They balanced each other like a well-designed government, which, in effect, they were. The Chancellor's military adventures added another dimension to his growing legend. When Henry decided to assert royal rights in Wales, Thomas didn't just organise supplies and negotiate with allies. He raised his own troops, more than the king's own contingent, and led them personally. The sight of the Chancellor in armour, directing sieges with the same precision he brought to tax collection, became one of those images that defined the new regime. His military expenditures were as lavish as everything else about his chancellorship. Thomas's knights were equipped with the finest armour, rode the best horses, and generally looked like they'd stepped out of an illuminated manuscript about ideal warriors. His camp was run with the same efficiency as his administrative departments, with proper sanitation, regular supplies, and the kind of organisational charts that would make modern military planners weep with envy. The Welsh campaigns were moderately successful militarily and hugely successful politically. They demonstrated that Henry's government was unified, that his Chancellor was completely loyal, and that resistance to royal authority would be met with well-organised, well-funded, and well-dressed force. Thomas had turned warfare into another form of administrative excellence, which was either inspiring or terrifying, depending on which side you were on. But it was the Toulouse campaign of 1159 that truly showcased Thomas's transformation from clerk to courtier to military commander. Henry's claim to Toulouse through his wife Eleanor was tenuous at best, but medieval claims were like modern lawsuits. The validity mattered less than the resources you could throw at them. And Thomas threw everything. His preparations for the campaign were meticulous to the point of obsession. He assembled not just an army, but a mobile advertisement for English power. His personal contingent included 700 knights, more than most kings could field, each equipped to standards that suggested Thomas had discovered a way to mint money. The baggage train was so extensive it required its own organisational structure, with departments for everything from spare horseshoes to diplomatic gifts. The campaign itself was less a military expedition and more a royal progress, with armour. Thomas's forces moved through France like a very expensive parade, demonstrating English wealth and power to anyone who cared to watch. Castles were besieged with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested Thomas had read every military manual ever written and decided to improve on them. Though Toulouse itself remained unconquered, King Louis VII of France intervened, and even Henry wasn't ready to attack his feudal overlord directly. The campaign succeeded in its real purpose. It established Henry as a major player in European politics, and Thomas as more than just an administrative genius. The Chancellor who could reform the exchequer could also lead armies, negotiate with princes, and generally embody royal power in all its forms. Back in England, Thomas's reforms continued with mechanical precision. He overhauled the chancery, standardising the production of royal documents and creating a system where every writ, charter and letter was recorded and archived. Future historians would thank him for this, though his contemporaries mostly grumbled about the increased paperwork. He reformed the royal household, creating departments with clear responsibilities and chains of command. The medieval equivalent of an organisational chart began to emerge, showing who was responsible for what and to whom they reported. It was revolutionary in its clarity and terrifying in its implications for those who had previously thrived in administrative chaos. The coinage was standardized because having multiple types of currency was inefficient and made embezzlement unnecessarily mathematical. Thomas introduced new designs that were harder to counterfeit and easier to account for. He even reformed the royal mints, ensuring that the king's coins actually contained the amount of silver they claimed, a novel concept that confused counterfeiters and pleased merchants. His diplomatic activities were equally impressive. Thomas negotiated with everyone from the Pope to the Count of Flanders, always advancing English interests while maintaining the fiction that everyone benefited from his proposals. He had the gift of making England's gain seem like universal good, possibly because he genuinely believed that what was good for England was good for civilization. His correspondence network stretched across Europe. Letters flowed to and from the Chancery in volumes that suggested Thomas never slept or had discovered cloning. He maintained contacts with cardinals in Rome, merchants in Flanders, scholars in Paris, and spies everywhere. Information was power, and Thomas collected it with the dedication of a miser hoarding gold. As the 1150s progressed, Thomas's influence grew to the point where some wondered whether England was ruled by Henry or his Chancellor. The answer, of course, was both. They had created a partnership so effective that it was hard to tell where royal will ended and chancellorial implementation began. Henry provided the vision and energy, Thomas provided the methods and machinery. Together, they were transforming England from a feudal patchwork into something resembling a unified state. The barons watched this transformation with alarm disguised as respect. Here was a government that actually worked, that knew what everyone owned and owed, that could project power effectively and collect taxes efficiently. It was their worst nightmare. Competent central authority. Some began to mutter that the Chancellor had too much power, that a merchant's son shouldn't stand so high, that things had been better in the old days when government was more of a suggestion than a system. The Church's concerns were different, but equally serious. Thomas's success in strengthening royal authority inevitably meant conflicts with ecclesiastical independence. For now, he managed these tensions through diplomatic brilliance and personal relationships. But thoughtful bishops wondered what would happen when diplomacy failed, when the interests of church and crown diverged too far to bridge. Thomas himself seemed unaware of these gathering storms, or perhaps he was too busy to notice. His days were filled with administration, his evenings with diplomacy, his nights with correspondence. He had achieved everything he dreamed of as a young man in London: power, influence, wealth, and the friendship of a king. He was living proof that in the New England Henry was creating, merit mattered more than birth. His lifestyle reflected his success. The Chancellor's household had become a court within a court, attracting the ambitious, the talented, and the merely curious. His dinners were events where politics mixed with pleasure, where a casual conversation could reshape policy or ruin careers. His wardrobe had expanded to the point where it required its own staff, with robes for every occasion and jewels that could fund small wars. Yet for all his magnificence, Thomas remained effective. The splendour wasn't mere vanity, it was policy. A chancellor who looked powerful was powerful. A government that could afford such display could afford anything. Every silk robe, every jewelled chain, every lavish banquet was a message. England was rich, organised, and not to be trifled with. As 1160 dawned, Thomas Becket stood at the pinnacle of secular success. He had transformed the chancellorship from a prestigious but limited position into the engine of government. He had proven that a merchant's son could rise to heights previously reserved for the nobility. He had created systems and structures that would outlast him, reforming everything from accounting to military organisation. Most remarkably, he had maintained the trust and friendship of a king not known for either. Henry and Thomas remained as close as ever, their partnership seemingly unbreakable. They had shared dangers in war, triumphs in peace, and the day-to-day work of transforming a kingdom. They were friends in the truest sense, understanding each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. But medieval politics had a way of testing friendships, especially when those friends held power. Soon an unexpected vacancy would arise, a position that would require Thomas to choose between his loyalty to Henry and other considerations. The Archbishop of Canterbury's throne would become empty, and Henry would have what seemed like a brilliant idea. Why not place his most trusted friend in the highest ecclesiastical office in England? It would seem like the perfect solution, a way to ensure harmony between church and crown. What could possibly go wrong with asking Thomas to serve two masters? But that's a question for the next chapter. For now, picture Thomas at the height of his powers, Chancellor and friend to the king, architect of England's transformation, and completely unaware that his greatest test was approaching. The merchant's son from Cheapside had conquered the secular world. Soon he would be asked to conquer the spiritual one as well. And in trying to do both, he would discover that some heights are too dangerous to occupy, some loyalties too divided to maintain, and some friendships too precious to survive the weight of conflicting duties. By 1160, Thomas Becket had transformed the chancellorship into something that would have been unrecognisable to his predecessors. Where previous chancellors had been content with comfortable wealth and respectable influence, Thomas had created a position that rivaled royalty itself in magnificence and exceeded it in day-to-day power. His household had become less an administrative department and more a mobile kingdom, complete with its own army, treasury, and what amounted to a diplomatic corps. The numbers alone were staggering. Where most noble households made do with dozens of servants, Thomas employed hundreds. He had clerks who specialized in specific types of documents, because apparently having generalist clerks was insufficiently sophisticated. His stable contained horses organized by function: horses for war, horses for hunting, horses for ceremony, and horses for impressing people who were impressed by horses. He even had horses whose sole purpose seemed to be looking expensive while carrying equally expensive equipment. His kitchen staff could have fed a small army, which was fortunate because they often had to. A dinner at the Chancellor's table wasn't just a meal, it was a political event disguised as hospitality. The cooking staff included specialists in cuisines from across the known world, though, given medieval geography and food safety, cuisine was often a generous term. There were bakers, who produced bread sculptures that were too beautiful to eat but too politically significant not to, vintners who could discuss wine with the passion of theologians discussing transubstantiation, and sauce makers whose creations required ingredients that had travelled further than most diplomats. But it was Thomas's wardrobe that truly set new standards for governmental excess. His collection of robes would have made Byzantine emperors feel underdressed. Each garment was a statement of power, wealth, and the kind of attention to detail that suggested Thomas had strong opinions about thread counts. He had robes for signing important documents, different robes for signing slightly less important documents, and casual robes for those relaxed moments when he was merely redistributing the wealth of entire counties. The furs deserved special mention. Thomas didn't just wear fur, he wore fur with provenance. His ermine wasn't just white, it was pristine white, from animals that had apparently lived blessed lives before contributing to his wardrobe. His preference for what chroniclers called blooded fur, pelts from animals hunted in specific aristocratic ways, wasn't mere snobbery, it was a calculated statement that the Chancellor understood and could afford the finest distinctions of noble culture. The famous blooded fur incident, recorded with the kind of detail that suggests medieval chroniclers had different priorities than modern historians, involved Thomas rejecting a gift of fur because the animals hadn't been hunted with sufficient ceremony. The fur was perfect, the quality exceptional, but the provenance was insufficiently noble. It was the medieval equivalent of rejecting a Rolex because it wasn't purchased from the right dealer. This attention to detail extended to every aspect of his household. His chapel, because of course the Chancellor needed his own chapel, contained vestments that could have funded a small crusade. His altar furnishings were so elaborate that visiting bishops felt inadequate. Even his chaplains were dressed better than most parish priests, creating a hierarchy of magnificence that started with impressive and ascended to breathtaking. The Chancellor's travelling household was a logistical marvel. When Thomas moved between locations, it required the kind of planning usually reserved for military campaigns. First came the advance guard, ensuring the roads were clear and the destination prepared. Then came the baggage train, a serpentine procession of carts carrying everything from portable chapels to collections of legal precedents. The main household followed, a carefully orchestrated parade of servants, clerks, and guards. Finally came Thomas himself, usually managing to look spontaneously magnificent despite the hours of preparation required. His entry into foreign cities became legendary. When Henry sent him to Paris in 1158 to negotiate with Louis VII, Thomas didn't just bring a diplomatic delegation, he brought a statement of English power that could be seen from space, had space observation been available. The procession entering Paris was so extensive that Parisians lined the streets just to watch it pass, which, given Parisian attitudes toward anything English, was an achievement in itself. First came the pack animals, so numerous that observers lost count, each loaded with gifts that suggested England's primary export was ostentatious generosity. Then came the hounds and hawks, because apparently diplomacy required hunting options. The household servants followed, each dressed in livery that would have bankrupted minor nobles. The knights came next, their armour polished to mirror brightness, their horses stepping in perfect synchronization that must have required extensive rehearsal. Thomas himself appeared last, dressed in robes that chroniclers struggled to describe without resorting to poetry. He distributed arms with the casual magnificence of someone who'd found the philosopher's stone and decided to share. French nobles, who prided themselves on sophistication, found themselves outdisplayed by an English merchant's son, which must have been particularly galling. The negotiations themselves were conducted with equal flair. Thomas could argue in Latin with the fluency of a Roman orator, switch to French with the accent of a native Parisian, and return to English when he wanted to exclude certain parties from the conversation. He knew every precedent, every treaty, every obscure point of law that might favour English interests. He negotiated with the confidence of a man who knew his king would support him, and the style of someone who made supporting him seem like a privilege. His military adventures continued to blur the line between administration and aristocracy. During the Welsh campaigns, Thomas didn't just organise supplies, he led charges with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been reading too many chivalric romances. His armour, specially made and probably costing more than most knights' entire estates, became a symbol of the new order where competence mattered more than bloodline, but style mattered most of all. The Toulouse campaign of 1159 saw Thomas at his most gloriously excessive. His personal contribution to the campaign included 700 knights, 1,200 mounted sergeants, and a support staff that required its own organisational chart. The cost was astronomical, but Thomas treated it as an investment in England's reputation. Every perfectly equipped knight, every splendidly caparisoned horse, every gleaming weapon was a declaration that England under Henry II was not just powerful, but magnificently so. His camp during the campaign resembled a mobile city more than a military installation. There were designated areas for different functions, streets, or at least pathways with names, and the kind of organisational efficiency that suggested Thomas had missed his calling as an urban planner. Sanitation was managed with unmedieval attention to hygiene. Supplies arrived with clockwork regularity. Even the latrines were organised by rank, because apparently Thomas believed that everything should reflect proper hierarchy. The siege operations he directed combined medieval brutality with modern efficiency. Siege engines were constructed to precise specifications, operated by teams trained to Thomas's exacting standards. The assaults were timed with mathematical precision. Even the negotiations for surrender were choreographed, with Thomas knowing exactly when to appear merciful and when to appear implacable. Yet for all his military adventures, Thomas never forgot that his real power lay in administration. The exchequer under his reform had become a model of efficiency. Revenue collection increased not through new taxes, but through actually collecting the existing ones. The sheriffs, who had previously treated their positions as opportunities for creative accounting, found themselves facing a chancellor who knew exactly how much each shire should produce and had mathematical models to prove it. His legal reforms were equally thorough. Thomas created standardized forms for common legal procedures because having every clerk write their own version was inefficient and made forgery too easy. He established precedent books, collecting legal decisions in ways that would make future lawyers' jobs easier and current ones more accountable. He even reformed court procedures, introducing radical concepts like scheduling and expecting cases to actually reach conclusions. The diplomatic network he maintained was extraordinary even by modern standards. Thomas corresponded with everyone who mattered, and many who didn't yet but might. His letters to Rome navigated papal politics with the skill of someone who understood that the Vatican was essentially a very holy bureaucracy. His communications with other European courts balanced flattery with firmness, always advancing English interests while maintaining the fiction of mutual benefit. His intelligence network, though never officially acknowledged, was impressive. Thomas had informants in every major court, most minor ones, and probably some that didn't technically exist. He knew which bishops were plotting against royal authority, which barons were considering rebellion, and which merchants were smuggling goods past customs. This knowledge was power, and Thomas wielded it with the subtlety of a master chess player. The relationship between Thomas and Henry remained remarkably strong despite the potential tensions inherent in such a partnership. They hunted together, with Thomas displaying the kind of enthusiasm for blood sports that suggested his merchant origins hadn't completely civilized him. They worked together, spending hours discussing policy with the intensity of scholars debating theology. They even played together, engaging in the kind of competitive friendship that involved trying to outdo each other in everything from chess to charitable donations. Their friendship had evolved into something rare in medieval politics: genuine mutual respect. Henry valued Thomas not just for his administrative brilliance, but for his companionship. Thomas served Henry not just from ambition, but from real affection. They were, in many ways, the perfect partnership: a king with vision and a chancellor with the ability to implement that vision. But success in medieval politics was like climbing a tree. The higher you went, the more precarious your position became. Thomas's very success had created enemies. Barons who resented being efficiently taxed by a merchant's son whispered about his origins. Bishops who worried about royal encroachment on ecclesiastical privileges wondered whose side Thomas would take if forced to choose. Even some of Henry's other advisers, jealous of the Chancellor's influence, suggested that no subject should stand so high. Thomas seemed immune to these concerns, or perhaps he was too busy to notice them. His days were filled with the business of government, his evenings with the pleasure of politics, his nights with the correspondence that kept the kingdom running. He had achieved everything he'd dreamed of as a boy in Cheapside, and more. He was the second most powerful man in England, wealthy beyond his father's wildest dreams, respected by kings, and feared by anyone who had to account for their taxes. His lifestyle had become legendary throughout Europe. Rulers of small states couldn't afford to live as Thomas did. His household consumed resources that would have sustained small towns. His wardrobe alone represented more wealth than most nobles would see in a lifetime, yet somehow he made it all seem natural, as if merchants' sons routinely rose to such heights and lived with such magnificence. The irony, of course, was that this magnificence served a purpose beyond personal gratification. Every extravagant gesture, every excessive display, every perfectly choreographed ceremony reinforced the message that Henry's government was powerful, organized, and here to stay. Thomas had turned conspicuous consumption into state policy, making his personal splendor inseparable from royal authority. As 1161 began, Thomas stood at the absolute pinnacle of secular achievement. He had transformed the chancellorship, revolutionized English administration, and created a model of government that would influence European politics for centuries. He was proof that in the new world Henry was creating, ability mattered more than ancestry, that a clever boy from a merchant family could rise to heights previously reserved for the high-born. But medieval fortunes had a way of changing suddenly. Archbishop Theobald, Thomas's first patron and the man who had launched his career, was dying. His death would create a vacancy in the most powerful ecclesiastical position in England. The Archbishop of Canterbury was more than just the senior English churchman. He was the Pope's representative, the defender of church privileges, the one man who could tell the king no and make it stick. As Theobald's health declined, speculation grew about his successor. The position required someone who could balance religious duty with political reality, who could defend church interests without starting civil war, who could work with the king while maintaining independence. Various names were suggested, bishops with the right combination of piety and practicality. But Henry had a different idea. Looking at the impending vacancy, he saw not a problem, but an opportunity. Why struggle with an independent archbishop when he could appoint his own man? And who better than Thomas Becket, his trusted chancellor, his friend, the man who had helped him strengthen royal authority throughout England? With Thomas as both chancellor and archbishop, church and crown could work in perfect harmony. It was a brilliant idea in theory. Thomas already understood both worlds. He had the administrative skills to run the church efficiently, the political connections to manage ecclesiastical relations, and most importantly, proven loyalty to Henry. What could be more natural than asking him to add a mitre to his already impressive collection of headwear? Henry began dropping hints about his plan, testing reactions, building support. Some courtiers thought it inspired, a masterstroke that would solve the perpetual conflict between secular and spiritual authority. Others worried that it was too clever, that asking one man to serve both God and king was asking for trouble. The bishops were divided between those who saw opportunity in having one of their own as chancellor, and those who feared having the chancellor as one of their own. Thomas himself seems to have been curiously ambivalent about the prospect. When Henry first suggested it, Thomas reportedly laughed, pointing to his magnificent court dress and saying it hardly suggested spiritual authority. It was a characteristic response, self-deprecating on the surface, while probably already calculating how much gold thread was appropriate for archiepiscopal vestments. But beneath the jest lay a serious question. Thomas had spent his entire life climbing, transforming himself from merchant son to royal chancellor through careful calculation and strategic choices. Each transformation had required him to leave something behind: his merchant background for ecclesiastical service, his clerical status for secular power. Now he was being asked to transform again, to somehow combine secular and spiritual authority in one person. It was an unprecedented opportunity. As Archbishop and Chancellor, Thomas would be the most powerful subject in England, perhaps in Europe. He would have influence over both church and state, the ability to shape England's future in ways no one before him had imagined. It was everything an ambitious man could want. It was also dangerous. The church had its own laws, its own loyalties, its own understanding of authority that didn't always align with royal interests. Previous archbishops had clashed with kings over everything from taxation to judicial authority. The position came with responsibilities that couldn't be delegated or negotiated away. An archbishop's first loyalty was to God and the church, not to any earthly king, no matter how close a friend. As Theobald lay dying in early 1161, Thomas faced the biggest decision of his life. He could remain as Chancellor, secure in Henry's friendship and his own achievements, or he could accept the archbishopric, gaining even greater power, but also greater complications. It was a choice between the comfortable known and the magnificent unknown. For a man who had spent his life calculating advantages and seizing opportunities, it should have been an easy decision. The archbishopric was the logical next step in his rise, the chance to stand higher than any merchant's son had ever stood. With Henry's support, he could reshape the English church as he had reshaped the English government. He could be the bridge between church and crown, ending centuries of conflict through the simple expedient of embodying both authorities in one person. But something held him back. Perhaps it was an understanding that some positions came with costs that couldn't be calculated in advance. Perhaps it was a recognition that serving two masters, even when one of them was your best friend, was inherently unstable. Or perhaps it was simply that Thomas, for all his ambition, understood that there were some heights from which the only direction was down. As Chapter 3 draws to a close, we leave Thomas at this crossroads. Behind him lies a career of spectacular achievement. The merchant son who became the kingdom's chief minister, the careful clerk who became the magnificent chancellor, the outsider who became the king's most trusted friend. Ahead lies the possibility of even greater power, but also greater peril. The decision he makes will transform not just his own life, but the history of England. It will test every friendship, challenge every loyalty, and ultimately prove that in medieval politics the most dangerous position is often the highest one. But that transformation belongs to the next chapter. For now, picture Thomas in his chancellor's robes, surrounded by the magnificence he's created, contemplating a future that promises either ultimate triumph or ultimate tragedy. The blooded furs and golden chains, the armies of servants and perfectly organized administration, the friendship of a king and the fear of barons, all of it has brought him to this moment. The question is whether he'll have the wisdom to stop climbing, or whether ambition will drive him to reach for one more rung on a ladder that might not bear the weight of conflicting loyalties. The summons to Northampton arrived at Canterbury, wrapped in enough legal formality to suggest that someone had been reading law books with vindictive enthusiasm. Thomas was commanded to appear before the royal court in October 1164 to answer charges that started with financial irregularities and escalated to accusations that would have made Judas Iscariot seem like a model of loyalty. Thomas prepared for Northampton like a man preparing for his own execution, which, given Henry's mood, wasn't entirely unrealistic. He gathered his supporters, such as they were, organised his legal defence, such as it was, and most importantly, prepared his spiritual armour, which consisted mainly of prayers and an even itchier hair shirt than usual. The journey to Northampton was a medieval tragedy in motion. Thomas travelled with a small entourage, having learned that large retinues made convenient targets for royal harassment. He stopped at churches along the way, praying with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to build up spiritual credit for whatever was coming. Northampton Castle in October was as welcoming as a grave with architectural pretensions. The Great Hall had been prepared for what was clearly going to be less a trial and more a carefully choreographed humiliation. Royal supporters filled every available space. Armed men stood at every entrance, their presence a reminder that medieval justice often came with sharp edges. Henry had assembled a judicial dream team of bishops and barons who owed him favours, feared his wrath, or simply enjoyed watching powerful men fall. They sat in judgment like vultures in expensive robes, waiting for the feast of Thomas's destruction to begin. The charges were read with the kind of detail that suggested someone had been keeping very careful records. As Chancellor, Thomas had handled enormous sums. Now, every penny was questioned. Amounts that had been spent on Henry's wars were presented as embezzlement. Diplomatic gifts that had smoothed international relations were reframed as personal theft. It was creative accounting in reverse, turning years of loyal service into a catalogue of crimes. Thomas's defence was legally sound but politically futile. He produced records, cited precedents, and pointed out that everything he'd done as Chancellor had been at Henry's explicit instruction. The judges nodded politely and continued with their predetermined verdict. It was like arguing with an avalanche about the finer points of gravity. The first day ended with Thomas being fined an astronomical sum for contempt of court, apparently for having the temerity to defend himself. He was given until the next day to pay, which was like giving someone until tomorrow to grow wings. His supporters scrambled to raise the money, borrowing from anyone who hadn't already chosen sides in this increasingly bitter conflict. Day 2 brought new charges and new fines. The accusations grew more creative as the proceedings continued. Thomas was accused of everything short of causing bad weather and disappointing harvests, though given more time, Henry's lawyers probably would have found precedents for those too. But it was on the third day that the proceedings took a truly sinister turn. The charge of treason was introduced with a kind of casual malice that suggested it had been the goal all along. Thomas had, according to the prosecution, betrayed his oath of loyalty to the king by opposing royal will. The fact that he was opposing it, in his capacity as archbishop, was deemed irrelevant. Loyalty to the king superseded all other obligations, including those to God. Thomas's response was magnificent in its defiance. He appeared in full archiepiscopal regalia, carrying his metropolitan cross like a weapon. He'd celebrated Mass that morning using the liturgy for St. Stephen, the first martyr, which was about as subtle as a declaration of war. When he entered the hall, the impact was immediate. This wasn't a defendant. This was a prince of the church making a statement. The trial proceeded with increasing acrimony. Royal prosecutors presented their case with vindictive precision. Thomas responded with theological arguments that sailed over the heads of most present, but sounded impressively defiant. The bishops were caught between their ecclesiastical superior and their temporal one, most choosing the expedient path of looking at their feet and hoping not to be called upon. When it became clear that the verdict would be guilty and the sentence would be severe, imprisonment at best, death at worst, Thomas played his last card. He appealed to Rome, placing himself under papal protection and effectively internationalizing what had been a domestic dispute. It was a brilliant legal maneuver that also happened to be incredibly irritating to everyone who just wanted this mess concluded. The court exploded in chaos. Royal supporters demanded Thomas be seized immediately. Ecclesiastical supporters, the few who remained, argued that touching an archbishop under papal protection would result in excommunication. Legal arguments flew like arrows in a particularly erudite battle. Thomas stood in the centre of it all, clutching his cross and looking remarkably pleased with himself for a man facing imminent imprisonment. But Thomas had one more surprise. As the court descended into chaos, he simply walked out. Not dramatically, not quickly, but with the measured pace of someone who had decided that the proceedings had become too undignified for his participation. He walked through the great hall, past the shouting judges, past the confused guards, and out into the October evening. The escape that followed was part farce, part thriller, and entirely medieval. Thomas returned to his lodgings, where his supporters had already begun planning his flight. Disguises were procured, though disguising someone as distinctively tall and austere as Thomas was challenging. Routes were planned, horses prepared, and prayers said with particular fervour. As night fell, Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, Primate of all England, defender of ecclesiastical privilege, became Thomas the Fugitive. He left Northampton disguised as a monk, which, given his recent lifestyle choices, required minimal costume change. His escape route was circuitous, designed to confuse pursuit, though it probably confused Thomas's own party as much as any hypothetical pursuers. The journey to the coast was a medieval nightmare of bad weather, worse roads, and constant fear of capture. Thomas travelled by night, hid by day, and generally experienced all the discomforts of being a wanted man in an age before proper hotels or reliable maps. His companions later reported that he maintained his prayer schedule throughout, which must have been challenging when trying to remain inconspicuous. Meanwhile, Henry discovered Thomas's flight with the kind of rage that probably registered on seismographs, had they existed. The king's fury was spectacular, even by his standards. Orders flew out for Thomas's arrest, for the seizure of Canterbury properties, for various creative punishments for anyone who had aided the escape. It was medieval government at its most efficiently vindictive. But Thomas was already beyond Henry's reach. He had made it to the coast, where sympathisers had arranged passage to France. The Channel crossing was reportedly terrible, with storms that seemed personally offended by archiepiscopal presumption. Thomas spent the voyage praying, and probably reconsidering the wisdom of antagonising someone with as much temporal power as Henry. He landed in France on November 2, 1164, beginning an exile that would last 6 years. King Louis VII of France, ever happy to annoy his English rival, received Thomas with open arms and barely concealed delight. Here was the perfect tool for making Henry's life difficult, his own archbishop, in exile, claiming persecution, and available for whatever diplomatic mischief Louis could devise. Back in England, Henry's rage settled into cold determination. He seized Canterbury's revenues, expelled Thomas's supporters, and generally acted like a man who'd been personally betrayed by someone he'd trusted, which, from his perspective, he had been. The friend who was supposed to smooth church-state relations had instead become their greatest obstacle. The English bishops found themselves in an impossible position. Their archbishop was in exile, their king was furious, and they were caught between conflicting loyalties. Most chose the pragmatic path of nominal obedience to the king, while secretly hoping Thomas would either compromise or conveniently die. Neither seemed likely, given Thomas's talent for both stubbornness and survival. The Northampton trial had been intended to break Thomas, to force him into submission, or at least silence. Instead, it had transformed him into something more dangerous than a difficult archbishop. He was now a symbol, a living martyr, a cause célèbre for anyone who opposed royal authority or simply enjoyed good political theatre. From his French exile, Thomas began his campaign of letters, excommunications, and general ecclesiastical warfare. He had escaped the trap, but at the cost of everything except his principles. He was free, but freedom in exile was its own kind of imprisonment. He had defied the king, but defiance without power was merely gesture. The cloaks and daggers of Northampton had failed to capture Thomas, but they had succeeded in creating a crisis that would define the rest of Henry's reign. The financial charges had been exposed, as the pretexts they were. The real issue, whether the king or the church had ultimate authority, remained unresolved, and was now complicated by personal betrayal and public humiliation. As 1164 drew to a close, Thomas settled into exile, while Henry settled into resentment. Both men had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The archbishop who had fled in disguise would return eventually, but he would return changed by exile and hardened by persecution. The king who had driven him out would welcome him back eventually, but the welcome would be as false as the charges at Northampton. The debt of betrayal, accumulated over months of conflict, would require payment. In medieval politics, such debts were usually paid in blood, but that payment was still years away. For now, Thomas was free but exiled, defiant but powerless, righteous but alone. It was victory of a sort, but the kind of victory that felt remarkably like defeat. The year 1163 opened with the kind of tension that made courtiers develop mysterious illnesses, requiring immediate attention to distant estates. The relationship between Henry II and Thomas Becket had deteriorated from friendship through disagreement to something approaching mutual incomprehension, like two people discovering they'd been speaking different languages all along, but had only just noticed. The Council of Westminster, in October 1163, was where private disagreement became public spectacle. Henry, with all the subtlety of a siege engine in a pottery shop, demanded that the assembled bishops agree to his proposed reforms regarding criminous clerks. His argument was straightforward. If a member of the clergy committed a serious crime, they should be tried in church courts first, then handed over to royal justice for punishment. It was compromise, in the same way that allowing someone to choose their last meal before execution was compromise. Thomas, dressed in his full archiepiscopal regalia, which was still impressive, just in a more austere, I'm suffering for God way, stood before the king and the assembled bishops like a man who'd been rehearsing this moment. He argued that trying clerics twice for the same crime violated both canon law and basic justice. Once the church had tried and punished a clerk by stripping him of his orders, secular punishment would constitute double jeopardy. It was a sophisticated legal argument delivered with the confidence of someone who'd spent years mastering legal sophistication. The other bishops watched this confrontation with the fascination of people witnessing a disaster they couldn't prevent, but couldn't stop watching. Some supported Thomas out of principle, some out of fear of opposing their archbishop, and some because opposing the king while standing behind someone else seemed safer than doing it alone. Others desperately sought middle ground, which in this case was like looking for dry land in mid-channel. Henry's response to ecclesiastical resistance was characteristically direct. If the church wouldn't agree to reasonable reforms, he'd simply codify what he considered ancient customs governing church-state relations. Never mind that these ancient customs were about as ancient as last Tuesday and as customary as Henry's temper was mild. The result was the Constitutions of Clarendon, drawn up in January 1164. The constitutions contained 16 clauses that essentially made Henry the CEO of England, with the church demoted to a troublesome subsidiary that needed better management. Criminous clerks would ultimately face royal justice. Appeals to Rome required royal permission, turning the Pope into a sort of foreign consultant who could only be contacted through proper channels. Bishops couldn't excommunicate royal officials without the king's consent, which was like saying police couldn't arrest criminals without the criminal's permission. It was everything Henry wanted, and everything the church had spent centuries trying to prevent. The Council of Clarendon, where these constitutions were presented, was medieval political theatre at its most dramatic. Henry arrived with an army, because nothing facilitates reasonable discussion quite like several thousand armed men who happened to be in the neighbourhood. Thomas arrived with principles and a growing sense that martyrdom might offer better career prospects than compromise. Under enormous pressure, the kind that comes with implicit threats of violence and explicit threats of property confiscation, Thomas initially agreed to the constitutions. For a brief moment, it seemed the crisis might pass. Henry had won, Thomas had capitulated, and everyone could return to the normal medieval business of exploiting peasants and arguing about theology in more theoretical ways. But Thomas's agreement lasted about as long as a snowflake in hell, if hell existed and had snowflakes, which theologians assured everyone it didn't. Almost immediately he regretted his capitulation. He performed penance for his weakness, which involved even more hair shirts, creative fasting, and possibly some self-flagellation, though the details were kept private because medieval penance was between a man, his God, and his capacity for creative discomfort. He wrote to Pope Alexander III, explaining that he'd only agreed under duress. This was the medieval equivalent of claiming temporary insanity, except the insanity was political rather than mental. The Pope, who was dealing with his own problems, including an anti-pope, because one pope was never enough in medieval politics, and a Holy Roman Emperor who had opinions about papal authority, responded with diplomatic ambiguity that would have made modern UN statements look decisive. Henry, discovering that Thomas had reneged on his agreement, reacted with the calm rationality of a volcano discovering it was actually a volcano. He summoned Thomas to a council at Northampton in October 1164, ostensibly to answer charges about financial irregularities from his time as Chancellor. It was a transparent attempt to destroy Thomas through legal harassment, the medieval version of being audited by the IRS if the IRS could also confiscate your estates, exile you, and possibly arrange for your creative demise. The Council of Northampton was 8 days of pure political brutality disguised as legal procedure. Henry's supporters accused Thomas of every financial impropriety short of inventing new ones. They demanded he account for every penny that had passed through his hands as Chancellor. conveniently ignoring that most of that money had gone to support Henry's wars, building projects, and the kind of diplomatic gifts that kept England relevant in European politics. Thomas arrived at the council carrying his Metropolitan Cross like a weapon, which in medieval symbolic terms it was. He celebrated Mass using the liturgy for St. Stephen, the first martyr, which was about as subtle as wearing a sign saying, "I expect to be persecuted unto death." The choice of liturgy suggested either that Thomas had developed a flair for dramatic irony, or that he was genuinely preparing for martyrdom, possibly both. The trial, if it could be called that, was a foregone conclusion. Witnesses testified to financial irregularities with the kind of precise memory that suggested recent coaching. Documents were produced that proved Thomas had spent money as Chancellor, which was shocking only if you expected chancellors to work for free. The bishops, caught between their archbishop and their king, tried to convince Thomas to submit, to apologise, to do something that would let everyone save face and go home. But Thomas had passed the point where face-saving was possible or desirable. When the council prepared to pronounce judgment, he played his ultimate card. He appealed to Rome, placing himself under papal protection and essentially internationalising what had been a domestic dispute. It was like calling in the UN to resolve a neighbourhood dispute, if the UN had excommunication powers and the neighbours had armies. Then, in a move that combined wisdom with theatre, Thomas fled. On the night of November 2, 1164, he slipped out of Northampton disguised as a monk, which given his recent conversion to asceticism, probably required minimal costume change. He made his way to the coast, through weather that seemed designed to make his escape as dramatically difficult as possible, because medieval weather understood narrative requirements. The Channel crossing was reportedly terrible, with storms that threatened to end the story before it properly began. Thomas, showing either great faith or poor timing, insisted on travelling despite the weather. He landed in France on November 2, beginning an exile that would last 6 years and transform him from difficult archbishop to international cause célèbre. King Louis VII of France received Thomas with the enthusiasm of a man who'd just been handed a wonderful tool for annoying his rival. France and England were natural enemies, in the way that cats and dogs are natural enemies if cats and dogs had armies, territorial disputes, and centuries of mutual grudges. Having the Archbishop of Canterbury as a refugee gave Louis moral high ground and diplomatic leverage, two things French kings collected like others collected taxes. Thomas settled at the Abbey of Pontigny, a Cistercian house where the austerity would have killed normal people, but probably felt luxurious to someone wearing a hair shirt. He threw himself into monastic life with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found their calling, or at least their temporary calling while in exile. He prayed, he fasted, he studied, and most importantly, he wrote letters. The correspondence that flowed from Pontigny was extraordinary in both volume and vehemence. Thomas wrote to everyone, the Pope, cardinals, bishops, abbots, kings, and anyone else who might be useful or at least sympathetic. His letters combined legal argument, theological principle, and personal grievance in proportions that varied depending on the recipient. To the Pope, he was the persecuted defender of church liberty. To other bishops, he was their champion against royal tyranny. To Henry, he was the disappointed friend, forced into opposition by principle. Henry, meanwhile, discovered that exiling Thomas had solved nothing and created new problems. An absent archbishop was harder to control than a present one. Thomas in exile was a living martyr without the inconvenience of actually being dead. Worse, he had access to the papal curia and the French court, where he could make Henry's life difficult on an international scale. The war of letters that followed was a masterpiece of medieval passive aggression, elevated to an art form. Thomas wrote to Henry reminding him of their former friendship while threatening his immortal soul. Henry wrote to the Pope complaining about Thomas while protesting his deep respect for the Church. The Pope wrote to both, telling them to make peace, while carefully avoiding taking sides that might cost him support. Everyone copied everyone else on their correspondence, creating a medieval document trail that would have crashed servers if servers had existed. The rhetoric escalated with each exchange. Thomas compared Henry to biblical tyrants, stopping just short of calling him Pharaoh but making the parallel clear. Henry suggested Thomas was a traitor who'd forgotten his humble origins, though he phrased it more diplomatically. Both men claimed to want reconciliation while creating new obstacles to it with every letter. Thomas didn't limit himself to correspondence. From Pontigny, he began issuing excommunications like a medieval social media influencer blocking followers. He excommunicated bishops who supported Henry, royal officials who implemented the constitutions of Clarendon, and anyone else who sufficiently annoyed him. The excommunications were precisely targeted for maximum disruption and minimum possibility of reconciliation. Henry retaliated by threatening the Cistercian order, suggesting that harbouring Thomas might be bad for their English properties. The Cistercians, showing the kind of principled flexibility that kept monastic orders solvent, suggested to Thomas that perhaps he might be more comfortable elsewhere. Thomas moved to the Abbey of St. Columba at Sens, where he continued his campaign with undiminished vigour. The conflict had now spread across Europe like a particularly virulent diplomatic disease. Every court had to take sides, or at least pretend to, while actually maintaining neutrality. The Pope was bombarded with letters, legates, and complaints from both sides. Other monarchs watched with interest, calculating how they might benefit from the Anglo-ecclesiastical civil war. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, offered Henry an alliance against their common enemy the Pope, who was supporting Thomas. Louis of France continued to shelter Thomas while making concerned noises about reconciliation. The Count of Flanders tried to mediate, failed, and went back to whatever Counts of Flanders did when not mediating, which apparently involved textile production and carefully calculated neutrality. The ordinary people of England, meanwhile, suffered the consequences of their leaders' theological political theatre. When Thomas threatened to interdict a kind of spiritual embargo that would halt all religious services, it meant no marriages, no baptisms, no Christian burials. In an age when most people believed unbaptized babies went to limbo and unburied souls wandered the earth, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was terrifying. Henry's retaliations against church properties created their own problems. Seized estates meant displaced workers. Interrupted revenues meant unpaid obligations. The entire economic ecosystem that had developed around ecclesiastical properties began to collapse, causing ripple effects that reached from manor houses to merchant stalls. The dispute between king and archbishop was becoming everyone's problem. The English bishops found themselves in an impossible position. Supporting Thomas meant opposing the king, which could result in loss of lands, exile, or worse. Supporting Henry meant betraying their archbishop and potentially their souls. Most tried to find middle ground, which in this conflict was like trying to find a comfortable position on a bed of nails, theoretically possible but practically agonizing. Some bishops attempted shuttle diplomacy, carrying messages between the camps with the exhaustion of marriage counsellors dealing with a particularly acrimonious divorce. They would visit Thomas in France, listen to his grievances, nod sympathetically, then return to England to explain to Henry why his former friend was being unreasonable. Then they'd carry Henry's response back to Thomas, watch him explode with righteous indignation, and wonder why they'd ever wanted to be bishops in the first place. The negotiations that periodically erupted were exercises in futility disguised as diplomacy. Mediators would arrange meetings in neutral territories, usually French towns that had the misfortune of being conveniently located. Henry and Thomas would approach, surrounded by their respective entourages, like prize-fighters entering a ring. They would begin with protestations of desire for peace, move through increasingly heated discussions of principles, and end with one or both storming off in high dudgeon. The issues had become so entangled with personalities that it was hard to remember what the original dispute had been about. Was it criminous clerks, royal versus ecclesiastical authority, the constitutions of Clarendon? Or was it simply that two brilliant, stubborn men had reached a point where backing down would mean admitting error, and admitting error would mean admitting weakness, and admitting weakness was something neither could do? Years passed in this stalemate. Thomas aged in exile, his hair shirt presumably wearing thin along with his patience. Henry aged on his throne, his energy increasingly devoted to managing the crisis he'd created by trying to manage the church. Both men were trapped by their own intransigence, unable to compromise without feeling they'd betrayed everything they stood for. By 1170, exhaustion was setting in. 6 years of conflict had drained both sides emotionally, financially, and politically. Henry faced the prospect of permanent excommunication, which would give his enemies religious justification for rebellion. Thomas faced the prospect of permanent exile, which, however comfortable in French abbeys, lacked the satisfaction of actually running his archdiocese. Finally, in July 1170, A reconciliation of sorts was achieved at Fretteval. The meeting was arranged with all the careful protocol of arms limitation talks between nuclear powers. Henry and Thomas met, embraced with the warmth of people hugging porcupines, and agreed to disagree on fundamental issues while agreeing to stop actively trying to destroy each other. It was less a peace treaty than a ceasefire, but after 6 years of conflict, everyone was ready to take what they could get. Thomas would return to England. Henry would allow him to function as Archbishop. The constitutions of Clarendon would be quietly ignored rather than formally revoked. Everyone would pretend the last 6 years had been a familiar misunderstanding rather than a fundamental clash of principles. But both men had been changed by the conflict. Thomas returned not as a reconciled friend, but as a vindicated prophet. Henry welcomed him back not with genuine forgiveness, but with the calculation of a man who preferred his enemies where he could watch them. The stage was set for the final act of their tragedy, though that would be a story for another episode. As Chapter 5 draws to a close, we see the futility of the grand conflict that had consumed 6 years and achieved nothing but mutual exhaustion. Thomas, in his French exile, wrapped in righteousness and rough wool, had become a symbol rather than a man. Henry on his throne, surrounded by power but frustrated by its limits, had learned that even kings couldn't control everything. The letters would continue, the negotiations would resume, the principals would return to their positions, but something fundamental had broken between the two former friends. Trust, once shattered, could be glued back together, but the cracks would always show, and in medieval politics, cracks had a tendency to spread until the whole structure collapsed, usually onto someone's head. As we reach the final chapter of this first episode, let us step back from the later conflicts and return to that pivotal year of 1162, when all the pieces were set in motion but the game had not yet turned deadly. It is important to understand that the tragedy which would unfold was not inevitable. It was the product of choices made by brilliant men who couldn't see past their own brilliance. In the early months of 1162, as Archbishop Theobald lay dying, Henry II was at the height of his powers. His kingdom was more organised, more prosperous and more efficiently governed than it had been in living memory. His Chancellor, Thomas Becket, had proven to be the perfect instrument for royal policy, intelligent, dedicated and spectacularly effective. Together they had created a new kind of government, one that actually worked. The partnership between King and Chancellor had evolved into something remarkable. They were more than colleagues. They had become genuine friends, in an age when friendship between unequals was rare and dangerous. They hunted together, with Thomas showing surprising enthusiasm for blood sports despite his bourgeois origins. They worked together, spending hours in discussion that mixed policy with philosophy. They even played together, competing in everything from chess to charitable giving, with the intensity of men who had never learned to lose gracefully. Henry valued Thomas not just for his administrative genius, but for his companionship. Here was someone who could match the king's intellectual energy, who could argue without being treasonous, who could disagree without being disagreeable. Thomas, for his part, had found in Henry not just a patron, but a partner in the great work of transforming England from a feudal patchwork into a unified kingdom. Their successes had been extraordinary. The exchequer reformed, revenues flowing efficiently into royal coffers, the legal system standardized, justice becoming more predictable if not always more just, the coinage stabilized, trade flourishing as merchants could trust the currency. Even the baronage, that collection of semi-autonomous warlords, had been brought to heel through a combination of efficient administration and implicit threat. It was natural, perhaps inevitable, that Henry would look at the impending vacancy at Canterbury and see an opportunity rather than a problem. The Church in England was the last great independent power centre, with its own courts, its own taxes, its own allegiance to Rome. Previous archbishops had been thorns in royal sides, defending ecclesiastical privileges with the stubbornness of men who believed God was on their side, which he, inconveniently, might have been. But what if the next archbishop was already the king's man? What if the defender of church privileges was someone who understood that those privileges needed to be balanced against royal needs? What if, and this was Henry's masterstroke, the Archbishop of Canterbury was also the royal chancellor, serving both God and king in perfect harmony? Looking at Thomas, Henry saw the perfect candidate. Already ordained, though only in minor orders, Already experienced in church administration from his years with Theobald, already proven in his loyalty to royal interests, most importantly, already Henry's friend, bound by years of shared work and genuine affection, surely, Henry reasoned, those bonds would survive a change of costume. The logic was impeccable if you ignored several centuries of church-state conflict and the possibility that people might take their job descriptions seriously. Thomas as Archbishop could reform the English Church as he'd reformed the English government. He could modernize its administration, rationalize its finances, and, most importantly, align its interests with royal policy. It would be the culmination of everything they'd worked toward, a unified England where secular and spiritual authority worked in harmony. When Henry first broached the idea in early 1162, Thomas's response should have been a warning. He didn't leap at the opportunity as he had at the Chancellorship. Instead, he expressed doubts, concerns, even warnings. "Should God permit me to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, I would soon lose your Majesty's favour, and the affection with which you honour me would be changed into hatred," he reportedly said. It was an oddly prophetic statement from a man not usually given to prophecy. Perhaps Thomas understood something about himself that Henry didn't. Perhaps he recognised that he was the kind of man who threw himself completely into whatever role he occupied. As Chancellor, he had been the perfect Chancellor. As Archbishop, he would be, well, that remained to be seen. But Henry brushed aside these concerns with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through proper personnel management. He wanted Thomas as Archbishop, and what Henry wanted, Henry generally got. The king's will was like gravity. You could resist it temporarily, but eventually everyone fell into line. The election in May 1162 proceeded with all the spontaneity of a carefully rehearsed play. The monks of Canterbury, understanding which way the royal wind was blowing, elected Thomas with unanimous enthusiasm. The bishops of England, whatever their private reservations, publicly supported the choice. After all, opposing the king's clearly stated preference was a career-limiting move. On June 2, 1162, Thomas Becket was consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury, in a ceremony that combined splendour with speed. The haste was necessary because Thomas, despite years of church service, wasn't actually a priest. This minor technicality was resolved by ordaining him in the morning and consecrating him in the afternoon, setting some kind of record for ecclesiastical fast-tracking. The ceremony itself was everything a medieval consecration should be. Canterbury Cathedral was filled with incense, chanting, and the kind of golden implements that suggested the church had different ideas about poverty than its founder. Bishops from across England attended, their magnificent vestments creating a sea of silk and jewels. The king himself was notably absent, already in Normandy, but his presence was felt in every carefully orchestrated detail. As the ancient rituals proceeded, as the oil was poured and the prayers intoned, something shifted. The Thomas who knelt to receive the Archbishop's Mitre was the king's Chancellor, the king's friend, the king's man. The Thomas who rose was something else. Not entirely different, not yet, but changed in ways that would only become apparent with time. Henry, receiving news of the successful consecration in Normandy, was reportedly delighted. His plan had worked perfectly. His friend was now Archbishop of Canterbury. The last potential source of opposition to royal authority was now headed by the man who had done more than anyone to strengthen that authority. It was checkmate in the great game of English politics. Or so it seemed in June 1162. Thomas was Archbishop, Henry was triumphant, and England was poised for an era of unprecedented church-state cooperation. The merchant's son from Cheapside had risen to the highest ecclesiastical office in the land while maintaining his position as the king's right hand. It was a combination of offices that would make him the most powerful subject in England, perhaps in Europe. The future seemed bright with possibility. Thomas would reform the church as he had reformed the state. He would bring the same efficiency to ecclesiastical administration that he'd brought to royal government. Most importantly, he would ensure that church and crown worked together rather than at cross purposes. It was a vision of unified authority that appealed to everyone who valued efficiency over tradition. But even in those first heady days of Thomas's archiepiscopate, there were signs for those who knew how to read them. Thomas's immediate resignation of the chancellorship, returning the seal to Henry with thanks but firmness. his adoption of a more austere lifestyle, trading silk for simpler cloth, abundance for moderation. Small changes, perhaps, but in the symbolic world of medieval politics, small changes could signal seismic shifts. As summer turned to autumn in 1162, Thomas settled into his new role with characteristic thoroughness. He studied canon law with the intensity of a man preparing for battle. He familiarized himself with every privilege, every precedent, every tradition that defined the Archbishop of Canterbury's authority. He was, in short, taking his new job seriously, perhaps more seriously than Henry had anticipated. The king, still in Normandy dealing with continental concerns, remained confident. His letters to Thomas mixed the business of government with the warmth of friendship. They discussed policy and made plans, as they always had. The mechanism of government continued to function smoothly, with Thomas's replacements as Chancellor implementing the systems he'd created. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. But those closest to Thomas noticed changes. The man who had once devoted his considerable intelligence to advancing royal interests now seemed equally devoted to understanding ecclesiastical ones. He spoke of his duties to the church with the same passion he'd once reserved for administrative reform. He began to see conflicts where before he'd seen only opportunities for cooperation. As 1162 drew to a close, England stood at a crossroads, though few recognized it at the time. The king's clever plan to control the church by appointing his friend as its head was about to encounter the law of unintended consequences. The transformation of Thomas Becket from royal servant to divine servant was beginning, and with it would come one of the great conflicts of medieval history. But that conflict lay in the future. For now, in late 1162, there was still hope. Henry still believed he had made a masterstroke of political appointment. Thomas still believed he could balance his duties to both God and king. Both men still called each other friend, though the word was beginning to carry different meanings for each. The merchant's son from Cheapside had completed his rise, from the counting houses of London to the Archbishop's palace at Canterbury, from the son of a Norman trader to the most powerful churchman in England. Thomas Becket had achieved everything ambition could desire. He stood at the pinnacle of both secular and spiritual authority, trusted by the king, respected by the church, feared by those who understood that such a combination of powers was inherently unstable. As our first episode draws to a close, we leave Thomas in his Archbishop's palace, still new to his role, still learning its demands, still believing perhaps that he can serve both Caesar and God with equal devotion. We leave Henry in Normandy, still confident in his choice, still trusting in his friend, still unaware that he has created not a solution but a problem that would define the rest of his reign. The stage is set, the actors are in place, and the great drama of church and state is about to begin. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, friend of the king, defender of the church, stands poised between two masters, two loyalties, two understanding of authority that would prove impossible to reconcile. It had seemed like such a clever idea. Make your best friend the Archbishop and ensure harmony between church and crown. What Henry hadn't considered was that some positions come with their own logic, their own demands, their own transformation of the men who hold them. The mitre, it would turn out, was more than just an impressive hat. It was a responsibility that would change Thomas Becket from the king's greatest asset into his greatest challenge. But those challenges, those conflicts, those tragic consequences belong to future episodes. For now, as 1162 ends and our story pauses, Thomas Becket stands at the height of his success, wearing his new authority with the same confidence he'd worn his Chancellor's chains. The future stretches before him, full of possibility and peril in equal measure. The merchant's son has become a prince of the church, the king's friend has become God's servant. The transformation is beginning, though its full implications remain hidden. In the gathering darkness of a December evening in 1162, as candles flicker in Canterbury Cathedral and the last prayers of Vespers echo through ancient stones, Thomas Becket kneels before the altar, Archbishop and friend, servant of God and companion of kings, unaware that these roles will soon demand choices that friendship cannot survive. Sleep well, and dream perhaps of a time when brilliant men believed that intelligence could overcome tradition, that friendship could bridge fundamental divides, and that power shared was power doubled rather than power divided. Dream of Thomas and Henry in 1162, still friends, still partners, still unaware that they have set in motion events that will end in blood on cathedral stones. But that ending is many episodes away. For tonight, let them remain friends, let their plans remain intact, let their hopes remain undashed. Tomorrow will bring its own troubles, its own conflicts, its own tragic revelations. But tonight, in the last days of 1162, all things still seem possible, even the impossible reconciliation of duties that centuries of history suggest cannot be reconciled. Good night, and may your sleep be more peaceful than Thomas Becket's would soon become. May your friendships prove more durable than those tested by power, and may your ambitions lead to less complicated endings than that of the merchant's son who rose too high and fell too far. The candles are extinguished, the cathedral is quiet, and our first episode ends where Thomas's great trial begins, with a man kneeling between two masters, not yet forced to choose, not yet aware that choosing was inevitable. Sleep well. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.